Now that we have discussed a lot about CSS and we have discussed all of the basic concepts of CSS and how we can use the CSS properties to create web pages, let us now quickly introduce Bootstrap, which is a CSS framework which allows us to kind of ease out the development of our CSS. And let's get started with iDigitalpreneur. So the first question is, what is Bootstrap? Now, Bootstrap essentially is a CSS framework which is used to create highly customizable and mobile friendly components in your application, and it allows developers to quickly create highly efficient and customizable UI components with ease, of course, and which is consistent in design practices and uniformity. Now, essentially, the use or the advantage of Bootstrap is as and when your code base increases in complexity, you will find writing a lot of CSS code to be cumbersome. Because if you're writing custom CSS, you actually have to take note about the performance of the file loading. You have to take care of the classes names, and you have to write a lot of CSS code to basically achieve a very minimal thing. This is what CSS frameworks like Bootstrap kind of tries to compensate for, because Bootstrap gives you a predefined set of classes already available which you can use directly in your HTML to get a design output which is standardized and consistent all across the web page. That is what Bootstrap is used for. And you will find often that any production level code base or any website which is made by organizations, Bootstrap and Tailwind and Chakra UI and all of these other basically CSS libraries and frameworks. And Bootstrap, because it is very convenient to use and it has a rather low learning curve, Bootstrap is perhaps one of the oldest and the most reliable CSS framework out there. So, what are some of the advantages of Bootstrap? Before we even start off by integrating Bootstrap in any of our web page, we have to understand the benefits of Bootstrap first. So, it allows us to quickly create highly customizable UI components with a bunch of predefined classes which are already available. You don't actually have to write a lot of CSS to achieve a certain type of design, which we will see in the next video once we go into documentation and try to figure out how these components are made. You can just directly import that component in your web page, and it allows the developer to focus more on the logic and the overall functionality of the web page rather than thinking about the design aspect of the entire UI component. So that is one advantage of Bootstrap. The second advantage would be that it is consistent all across the code base. If you are using a certain component or if you are using a certain design procedure, it is consistent all across the code base. There will not be two different UI elements having, or if you wanted two different UI elements to have the same stylings, you don't actually have to worry it. You can use that same instance of the components in multiple places, and you can be assured that the component design is going to be consistent all across your code base. And Bootstrap, because it has been created by some of the design experts in the industry, in the world industry today, so the design standard is basically consistent all across. So you will find that the design actually is equivalent to, or it kind of relates to, the user experience, what a user experiences to be a good design. So all of that philosophy behind a good user experience or a good design, that has been taken care of. And finally, one of the most major advantage of Bootstrap is that it comprises the mobile friendly approach. So whatever component you make, it is always mobile friendly, it is responsive in nature. So actually it eliminates a lot of your work in which you would actually have to go ahead and write out a lot of media queries to create your entire web components and your layouts in a mobile friendly fashion. So Bootstrap also covers that. So these are some of the basic advantages of Bootstrap, because these advantages kind of help us to integrate, it kind of help us to create a scaffold basic projects and modules easily without having to think about a lot in the CSS codes. The Now, with the advantages, of course, there comes disadvantages. Now, disadvantages of Bootstrap can be summarized as follows. It can be complicated at times, and it definitely has a learning curve, because if you are directly coming in from vanilla CSS or raw CSS, understanding the underlying theory of Bootstrap can be a little complicated, because the way we think about Bootstrap is a little different from the way we think about writing CSS code. But the learning curve is not very high, but it still is considerable. And it can become complicated at times if you are working on really large code bases with a lot of different stylings and approaches. The second disadvantage would be, because Bootstrap is a bunch of predefined classes, there can be conflicting class names at times. It's possible that alongside with the Bootstrap, you want to use your own custom class names. Now, by any sheer luck, if those two classes conflict, then it depends on how you were calling out your CSS or how you were loading your CSS, that will determine which exact class will be applied to a certain HTML element. So this is one of those disadvantages which kind of makes Bootstrap a little complicated to work in scenarios in which you have to think about a lot of custom CSS. The third disadvantage would be that it is not a lot of flexible and customizable, because it is a framework and it has a predefined way of working. So you cannot have a lot of flexibility and customizability of Bootstrap. You have to remain within the standard designs of Bootstrap. And if you want a different feel out of your web page, you definitely would have a hard time customizing it. And finally, the last disadvantage is that because it is a CSS frameworks, and frameworks have a definite way of defining something. So if you want something to be completely customizable but still follow the standard practices and the design standards of Bootstrap, you actually have to go ahead and write a fair bit of configurations inside of a Bootstrap, which can kind of be conflicting at times, and you actually have to debug your code to understand where exactly your design went wrong. Now, because any advantage comes with disadvantage, so there are a lot of options apart from Bootstrap, but because Bootstrap kind of covers majority of the problems that any production level code base requires, or any production level web application requires, so that is why we are going to see a lot about Bootstrap. We will see how we can integrate Bootstrap easily into our web page, and we can start directly importing components in the next video. Till then, goodbye.